Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me from the great city of Franklin, Tennessee, is my friend Eric Jacobson, President and CEO of the Battle of Franklin Trust. How you doing, Eric?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
And this is an especially auspicious day for you because you get to have that fantastic experience of having a box of brand new books you've authored show up on your porch today.
Yeah, I think there's actually about 95 boxes coming. The first run's like 1,000. Yeah, I actually posted something last night that it's been over a decade since my last book was published, and so I've written a lot of stuff in between articles, interpretive markers, but it's been a long time since I've had this feeling, and it's I don't find writing to often be terribly enjoyable.
Hmm.
Um, some music artists don't like making records; they like going out and touring. And so, yeah, the writing is. I'm glad it's over, and now I can see it. And the best part is people can read it, and hopefully they like it.
Uh, so now the book is about the Cheairs family. Tell us the title and we'll kind of get into who this family is and why you got interested in them.
Well, there's two volumes. So today's volume one, and then volume two comes out probably late summer, early fall. But the main title is The Cheairs Family and RippaVilla, which was the place they called home. So the subtitle of volume one is The Old Union. That's what's coming out today. And then subtitle of volume two is A Rebirth of Freedom. So in short, volume one really tracks this family as they come to Tennessee in the early 1800s through the middle of the Civil War. And then volume two picks up with the middle of the war all the way through Reconstruction and the tumult of the late 19th, early 20th century, and all the way up to General Motors arriving in Spring Hill, which really transforms that town, but ultimately helps save RippaVilla as a historic site. So it really is almost 200 and probably 20 years of history that I cover in. That's why it ended up being, you know, War and Peace, volume one. When I got to like 600 pages, I thought, oh my God, nobody's ever going to read this. So I got to split it in half.
Yeah.
And I think it's the most enjoyable project I've ever worked on.
Was and it's not just like, oh, here's a book about some random family, but I mean you've got an entire history of a community. You've got war history in there, but I mean this is like you use the family as a snapshot to look at this broader picture too.
Yeah, that's what it turned into because I started this almost exclusively because we began to manage RippaVilla in 2021. And there was a lot of history that just had not been fleshed out and revealed. So I started just with the family and the site and, kind of the Spring Hill area. Well, it became evident to me, I had this kind of like whipshaw moment when I felt like I was working on my first book again.
Uh,
And what I meant was when I started digging into Spring Hill and Franklin from a military perspective, there was a lot of stuff that no other writers had ever gotten into. And that's probably my proudest statement about what I've done. There was just a lot about the armies that nobody had ever dug into. And as I got into the Cheairs family and their world, I realized, oh my goodness, this is actually a story about America, but in particular the southern part of America that I had long wanted to tell. I've been fascinated with how did we go from where we were like 250 years ago right now
uh,
to the precipice of this horrible war. And this family actually allowed me to do that. And, once again, you get to know dead people about as well as you can know dead people.
uh,
And they have all of our complexities. Um, and they lived in a world that was changing very, very quickly. For example, Nat Cheairs is born in 1818. So when John C. Calhoun is promoting nullification and Andrew Jackson pushes back on him, which is a pretty substantial part of one of my chapters of volume one, Nat was, I mean, he was 10 years old, 11 years old.
Mm.
So he's growing up in that world. He's being greatly influenced by that new dogma, which is that the states could do whatever they wanted. And so he'd already grown up in a slave-based society. So once you got that railroad track gets built, you can see how then we start to move toward this abyss. And it was almost impossible to avoid. It's like if you're driving a car toward the Grand Canyon, there's no real hard rights or lefts. All of a sudden, you just go right over the edge. And oh my gosh, in Tennessee, this is where Tennessee and Virginia are so similar. They were the centers of the world in those um, in those decades because they were controlling so much of the social and the political dynamic. And those two states, I think South Carolina and Mississippi could never do what they ended up doing without the power of Virginia and Tennessee ultimately getting behind their efforts.
Yeah. And that must have been an interesting dynamic for Nat and the people around him, where you've got this nullification theory that is, coming to the forefront, and then the chief opponent of it is from Tennessee. I mean, and Jackson's presence there is a pretty big influence.
Oh
That
my,
must have been
yeah.
a crazy dynamic.
I learned more about antebellum politics, but particularly about the discourse that's going on, especially in Tennessee, because here, this is, I mean, you kind of have to be nerds like us to appreciate this, but, years from now, people are going to be writing about the political dynamic of the early 21st century, right? They're going to look at the evolution of the Democratic and Republican parties into what we know they are right now. And so that's important, I think, to understand that in the moment of the 1830s and 40s, there's a big fight in the South between Democrats, um, secessionist leaning Democrats like Calhoun, and the old Union Democrats of Jackson, what they call Jackson Democrats. But then you have the Cheairs. They were Whigs. Okay, so the Whigs are their own hybrid kind of thing. And they were very, very dedicated Whigs. And so I began to understand all of the stuff that's unfolding. And of course, not just Jackson, but in the aftermath of that, James K. Polk, who was from Murray County.
Right.
So, like, the Cheairs knew him, and he's a Democrat. And, you know, he's James K. Polk only wins the presidency because he gets Northern support, because there was this huge political gulf that's beginning to unfold in the 1840s that we know as Northern and Southern Democrats.
Uh,
And
so
yeah, they see this world unfolding, and it's hard to ignore the parallels, the political parallels of today, meaning you're seeing the parties kind of splinter.
mm,
And I think people like Nat Cheairs, big landowner, he and his wife owned 75 slaves in 1860, but they looked around him, and I know that they actually thought that some of the people they knew were descending into madness. They couldn't believe what was happening.
uh, let me maybe back up just a second, because you mentioned RippaVilla, and I want to kind of get back to Nat Chairs in a second, but RippaVilla might be the way most people are familiar with this story. That might be their entree into this story. Tell us, like, what is RippaVilla? Where is it? How does it kind of serve as a basis for you to start this exploration?
Well, so RippaVilla was in the modern era was open to the public in the 1990s. So about a decade after General Motors arrived and built the big plant south of Spring Hill, RippaVilla was opened up, and there was obviously focus on the Cheairs family, but its sort of singular importance was within the military campaign, Hood's Tennessee campaign, because the Battle of Spring Hill and what happens and doesn't happen there leads to the Battle of Franklin. So it became very much the place where people could visit to understand how the Federal Army had escaped and various uh, Confederate errors. One of the things that I am able to do in Volume 2 is, and I'm sure you've heard about uh, and Ricky and I did a video on the breakfast meeting years
Right.
ago because there's this whole breakfast meeting where Hood's screaming at the generals about the Yankees escaping, and they have the whole breakfast menu like they're at Cracker Barrel, like we know what they're eating. And I can tell you now that it never happened. It was the whole story was literally just invented out of whole cloth in the 1920s after the Cheairs had left RippaVilla. So, but that doesn't change the big story, which is how close the Confederates came to blocking the Columbia Turnpike and cutting off John Schofield, because that's where Hood wanted to have the battle. But of course, it ended up in Franklin. So that's really, I think, for the kind of Civil War crowd, that's what RippaVilla is to them. And it's something we obviously talk about that every day on tour. But just like at Carnton and Carter House, the families that lived there for a century, so long before and long after the war, and it's been so much fun.
And then the Battle of Franklin Trust started managing the site not too long ago. What is it that got the trust interested in the property and invested in it?
Well, that's me. That was my fault. I although I've worked in Franklin for over 20 years, I always lived in Spring Hill. I love Spring Hill. I don't love, in some ways, what it's turned into, which is a city it's just kind of sprawled out everywhere. But the city has embraced its past really in a way that they haven't done in a long time. And so when RippaVilla, which was run by a nonprofit, the city owns the site. The relationship with the prior nonprofit just became untenable. And so they were fired, and the city put out an RFQ. And we were the only organization that applied, because I went to my board and I said, A, I'm very familiar with the site, but most importantly, it is directly connected to what we do every day. And I don't believe that there's anybody better suited to manage it than us. And the city agreed. And we now have a contract that runs through 2037. So long term, um, we're going to build a visitor center there too, which the site has never had, because it really deserves it. It's a site where you can I think it has much more of a national story than it's probably ever been given credit for,
Mhm.
because as I worked on this book, it is early American, early Tennessee history all the way through. General Motors arriving in the 1980s was a revolutionary moment in the history of the country. And these big automotive plants, which were being built to compete with Japanese cars,
Mhm.
that's a story in and of itself.
Uh, uh,
The dynasties of the Fords and Chevrolets, and that was suffering. And so Saturns, which were made by General Motors, were going to change all that. And anyways, that's a kind of broad answer to the question.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, and I love Spring Hill. I mean, I think it's a great town. There's so many different layers of Civil War history, a great story, and certainly its tie into the Battle of Franklin is fantastic. Um, and so for you guys to kind of then say, like, look, this is really important to our overall story. Let's get in there. Let's kind of help frame all of this. Did you know the Cheairs family really well before you kind of moved into the house?
Enough to, you know, be somewhat dangerous,
Okay.
right? You know, like I could talk to you about day one, two, or three at Gettysburg, but it's kind of up here,
Yeah.
you know. And what I learned showed me that I only knew 5%.
Yeah.
I learned so much about them, but also about the book ends up focusing very much on Nathaniel Cheairs, is the man who brings the family to Tennessee. And he had a number of children, and his son, also named Nathaniel, is the man who lived there at the time of the war and served in the 3rd Tennessee Infantry. But I focus really on all of those siblings. So it's Nat, his brothers Martin, John, Thomas, and then his sisters Nancy, Louisa, and Polly. So I follow the family out into Mississippi, which is another expansion story. I follow a sister into Missouri, which is an expansion story. But then it always circles back to Nat and his wife Susan and RippaVilla and Spring Hill. And so I constantly am bouncing back and forth between this very personal story out into the national fabric and explaining to people as best I can all of the things that are happening up until the time of the war, which really aren't even political related. Like there's a moment in there where I wrote about the invention of the sewing machine. You're probably thinking, why would Jacobson write about this? Well, the sewing machine revolutionized society because now you could mass produce clothing. But then it also hit me. You could mass produce uniforms. All of a sudden, an invention had been something had been created that would be used as a weapon of war. And and so I learned so much. Probably the one story, and maybe you were going to ask this, is I got into the murder of Earl Van Dorn, which
Okay.
actually happens at Martin Cheairs' house. Without giving too much away, that story is, I think you probably know what my take is it's horrible. It's
Yeah.
not this sort of seedy, romance story about cheating on a spouse. It's actually just a horrible story. But I think it deserves to be told factually so that we can understand the gravity of what actually happened that spring in 1863.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of those stories that just seems to titillate and attracts people's attention because it seems so sleazy and, but there's actual history there.
There
And
is.
it's a personal drama, not a sensationalistic.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know what I figured out with that story, just like so much that I'd done with my first book, there was so much kind of oral tradition and legend that had grown out of Middle Tennessee and Murray County related to almost everything in the war era. And it was like, a really foggy day where you can barely see off your deck or across the road, and you have to kind of just peer through it or go through it to get to where you need to be. And it was this opaque layer that had covered up everything.
Mm,
And that was another one. And I think that when the truth was sort of lost, the legend just grew.
sure.
It's sort of like Hood. Well, the Federal Army escaped, so he had to be an idiot or he had to be on drugs. And so the legend not only obscures the truth, the legend actually grows like exponentially. And I just love cracking those old myths.
Now, was there a moment as you got into this where you just knew you had to spend time with Nate and his family? Like, some particular factoid or some story that you're like made the light bulb go off.
Um, I think the one thing that comes to mind, I may have already been there. Uh, I realized pretty quickly that I wanted to tell a bigger story and I couldn't just focus on him because he was very close to his brothers. He was very close to one of his sisters. And then the other brother and sister had moved out of state. So I don't have any siblings, but I obviously my wife's got a bunch of brothers and sisters and they're all very close. They're an intimate part of someone's life that, there's your siblings are, I think, are as close to you as your parents in some ways. So I wanted to tell their story, but here's the day when I went, oh, oh boy. We found out that Nat Cheairs had fathered a child with an enslaved woman.
Ah, okay.
And that child, his name was Gilbert, he became a USCT.
Ah,
And we know the name of the woman, the mother. And I thought, okay, this adds a whole layer, a different dimension to this.
right.
This happened before Nat was married. I'm not sure that his wife ever knew. I know that Nat's mother knew because she ended up splitting up the mother, the child, and Nat after Nat's father died. And I think the father knew. So this was a very intimate family secret. But once dad died, mom decided that her solution was to split everybody up. And what I realized was this was happening all across the South, not at every place, but we all know there were biracial or mulatto children everywhere. And these were the dirtiest secrets inside the slave system. And the perniciousness of Mrs. Cheairs to break up that family unit and literally send one out of state, one down the road, and make Nat live in that world. I can't even imagine what was really going on, but I know what she did. And I thought, oh my goodness, I have to go. I have to keep going on this. I have to keep telling this story.
Yeah.
They had a chance encounter, Gilbert and Nat, after the Civil War. We knew that they had at least met one time because Gilbert wrote about it in his pension application. We had long thought it had happened in Tennessee, but it didn't. It happened in Arkansas. And I think it was a chance encounter because Nat was out there tending to some land that his sister owned. And Gilbert, after the war, had gone back to the same farm where he had been. That's where he got sent. He got sent
Okay.
to Arkansas. His mom got sent to Missouri. And Nat and I think Gilbert chanced upon each other one day. And I was like, oh, God, this is like a scene out of a movie.
Yeah.
And Gilbert Cheairs, check this out, man. He was buried in a cemetery in Nashville. And he was buried, his tombstone had the wrong name on it. And we got it changed.
Oh, wow.
We
Wow.
worked with we got one of the senators from Tennessee, Senator Haggerty, who helped us with the Veterans Affairs Office at the National Cemetery in Memphis and got the grave marker changed,
Wow.
which is
That
a
is
story, I tell as well.
that is a wicked cool. How did you tell that it was the wrong name in the first place?
Well, when he got sent to Arkansas, his name was Gilbert Cheairs, but they decided they already had a Gilbert. His sister and husband already had a Gilbert. So they just changed his name to Nat. That's not a coincidence.
No, jeez.
And then they gave him their last name, which was Perkins. So he enlisted, his name became Nat Perkins.
Okay.
So it's just like, well, Chris Mackowski, your name is now David Smith. So when he enlisted, that was the name he gave.
Yeah.
But when he filed for his pension, he was using Gilbert Cheairs again.
Okay.
And I guess when the VA put the marker up at some point in the 20th century, they simply looked at the original enlistment paperwork. And we
Ah,
figured out when we pulled the pension that Nat Perkins was actually Gilbert Cheairs.
okay.
And
Wow.
well, the person who found it was our director of African and African American history. And when she brought it to me, I mean, I almost fell out of my chair. I was like, oh my goodness gracious.
So and did he know that Nat was his dad when they end up meeting?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
And I want people to read the book, so I don't want us to give away too much of the story here. But
What he never seemed to understand, though, this is interesting. So he was about 5 years old when Nat's father died. He always believed that his father was his owner
okay.
because he had no memory of his owner, which coincidentally was his grandfather. Do you
Mhm.
see how twisted this is?
Yeah, right, right.
And so he was always a little confused on that. And so we had to read the pension application over and over because initially we thought, well, maybe Nat's father was the father,
Hmm.
but he was too old. And we suddenly began to realize Gilbert simply believed they were the same person.
Okay, okay. Oh,
And
wow.
tragically, he was actually murdered in Memphis in 1912. He was working as a night watchman and someone robbed him and killed him.
Wow, wow.
That was his. And so I cover all of that story. I think it's probably one of the most personal stories that I've ever uncovered and also ever written about
Hmm.
because I don't know what the dynamic really was there.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'll never forget when I read the deed and his mother called him the yellow boy Gilbert. And I was like, oh, yellow boy was always a term for biracial
Right.
because the skin tone was probably more copper, you know? Um, and that was immediately how you could tell someone was biracial.
Yeah, right, right. So now, as a researcher, this must have posed all sorts of challenges. I'm fascinated by this because first you've got an African American enslaved person who's sent away, and so like there's just not a lot of records associated with enslaved people in
Mm-mm.
that regard. So the detective work to figure this out must have been incredible and a little daunting.
It's very much like my first book, except the biggest advantage today is the online accessibility to deeds,
Hmm.
probate records, and newspapers. And what we found, especially related to African American or enslaved history, was never in the newspapers. It was all in the probate records, which are often estates, wills, and then the deeds.
Okay.
When I found the deed, when um, when Sarah Cheairs deeded Gilbert and his mother to her daughters, when you read a deed, when the thing being deeded is a human being, and it was just filed in the Murray County Register of Deeds, there it was.
Wow.
Yeah, it is daunting, but then it's also revealing is the word that first comes to mind, but I think it just reshapes how you think about what was going on.
Mm.
There was a clinical nature to this that is often interwoven, I think, with real human emotions and feelings and thoughts. It's not like these people couldn't see one another or talk to one another. They did. And still it was happening. And yeah, it it's really a story about us, Chris. That's
Wow.
that's why I chose to go this route because this is really what we were doing to one another in the American South.
Yeah. So you mentioned that Nate Chairs grows up kind of in the community in this sort of environment. And, life goes on for him. He doesn't get booted out of town and out of state and stuff like that. What was life like growing up for him in that antebellum period as he's like growing into a young man and a member of the community and that sort of thing?
Okay, so this is a great question because first of all, until he was about 20 years old, I think he was the typical son of a wealthy landowner and slave owner. So it was a pretty good gig, right?
Yeah, right.
You know, um, I believe that his father had chosen a particular route for him. And I don't know whether it was to be a lawyer or whether it was to be something other than a farmer or a planter, because that's what the other two brothers had done locally, and then another one got shipped to Mississippi. I think the father had different plans for Nat, but Nat got an enslaved woman pregnant, and that changed everything.
Mm.
And I believe that he got Mary Ann pregnant in Missouri at his sister's house,
Ah,
which means dad dragged him back to Tennessee. And coincidentally, he suddenly gets married a few months later.
okay.
And he got married to the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the area. And I think it wasn't necessarily arranged, but I believe there's circumstantial evidence that dad said, okay, we're changing course. You're coming back here. And now you're going to just be a farmer.
Okay.
And he did. And that becomes the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey said.
And was it a successful marriage or was it just a business arrangement? Did they like each other? Did they thrive together?
I don't know.
Okay.
I I think I think like a lot of people, you married who you had to. You married who you were supposed to.
Okay.
And I think they got along.
Huh.
There's some great post-war stuff that goes on, which um, she's a very interesting person. Her family, the McKissicks, were a little bonkers.
Okay.
Um, there was a there was a little, the DNA strands were a little too tight among some of them. And so it was an interesting dynamic. Her father, so Nat's father-in-law, was a very interesting man. William McKissick was a incredibly wealthy man, landowner, entrepreneur. But yeah, they were interesting, let's say that.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose, as I think about it, probably an unfair question to ask because I can hardly understand my own marriage on the best of days. So asking you to explain someone else's marriage is
Yeah.
probably an unfair perspective.
And they were married 50 plus years.
Yeah.
Yeah, she died in 1893, and then from that point on, Nat kind of just was almost like a gypsy. He traveled all around. He doesn't like cold weather. He loved to be on the coast. He loved being in Florida and down by Corpus Christi. He loved the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you choose to interrupt your narrative going from volume one to volume two, partway through the war. Tell me, like as a writer, what kind of cliffhanger is that? What sort of conceit does that offer for you as a place to split that story?
Conceit is the exact right word because I had two volumes, so I could be somewhat conceited and clever and stop it at this right moment. So what I did was, so as everyone knows, in 1863, emancipation comes into play. So Nat was captured at Fort Donelson. He was in prison for a handful of months, and then he's home by the end of 62, and he just stayed there. So he was at RippaVilla for about 15 or so months. So he sees emancipation unfolding. And by the way, he and his brothers, any opportunity to make a buck, these guys are on it. They're
Uh,
selling hay and corn and grain to the Confederates because that's where Van Dorn's cavalry is at. So they're making, now granted, it's kind of like funny money. It's fake. It's Confederate script, so they probably never got anything for it. But anyways, he's there all through 63. Um, and then the moment he rejoined at the end of 63, he went into the commissary department, which is a funny kind of job. But the moment he left, young enslaved men at RippaVilla started to bolt. They
yeah.
were running. And we now know of at least 12 to 13, with the 13th is a little questionable yet. We know of at least a dozen enslaved men who became USCTs. Okay. So, um, that was a story that we decided to tell. And where I end volume one, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, several of these Cheairs and McKissick slaves ended up in several of them in the 111th USCT. They were captured at Sulphur Trestle, Alabama by Nathan Bedford Forrest in the fall of 1864. So that's right before the Tennessee campaign.
Yeah.
So I'm able to end the story with these former slaves who've become soldiers who are now captured. And what most people, either even if they do know it, they don't ever acknowledge it, is these soldiers were sent back into slavery. And so I know of a handful of these chair slaves who became soldiers who ended up getting shipped to Mobile, Alabama to work on the fortifications there till the end of the war. So that's where I stop. And then I start volume two with the Tennessee campaign, which of course comes right to the doorsteps of RippaVilla. But at that time, Nat Cheairs is sitting in another POW camp because he got captured, and he's at Camp Chase outside of Columbus, Ohio.
Oh, wow.
And he sits there for almost 15 months until he was finally released in March of 65 when Grant agreed to, let a lot of the Confederates out.
So when he returns to Spring Hill, I'm assuming it's just 100% different than when he left. I mean, the war has done its thing. How does a family like that rebuild? And how were you able to kind of use his story to kind of tell that larger story?
I think this is where volume two became, um, of the two, probably the most important part of the story
Hmm.
because volume one is like the opening act. And volume two, A Rebirth of Freedom, isn't just about freedom for an entire race of people. It's a really rebirth of freedom for the country, which is, I think, what Lincoln was talking about at the Gettysburg Address. It was our opportunity to move on with the basic construct of the country still being the same, meaning the Bill of Rights are still intact. The only right taken away was you couldn't own human beings anymore. And the Union was now a defined thing. He comes back, and yeah, everything has changed. He actually had to go through this process of amnesty because Johnson had an exception within his amnesty proclamation. If you owned, I think the number was, if you had value over $20,000, you had to go through a secondary phase, which was to specifically apply to the president for clemency.
Right.
So Nat had to do that. And then he had to swear fidelity to the new Constitution, which includes the 13th Amendment, which is sort of a groveling process, right?
Right.
Like Johnson is this is Johnson being really punitive. Like he's making the wealthy whites pay a price,
Yeah.
and he does it with intent. So Nat does that here, but Chris, I got to tell you, this is what I learned about Nat and about Tennessee and really about the South. These white men, especially the wealthy ones, there's a system of like honor and honesty that I didn't really quite, I think, either understand or grasp. They understood they'd lost.
Yeah.
And a natural result of that was, well, there's a price to be paid. And chiefly, we can't have slaves anymore. And B, we're going to have to just suck it up. But in Tennessee, they had to endure another level of punishment. The General Assembly took the rights of all of these white men, took their vote away. So they were disenfranchised. They seemed to even accept that because basically they were like, well, all the Republicans are in Nashville running the show, so what does it matter?
Right.
They accept this. Here's what they didn't accept. In February 1867, Tennessee took a step that no other Southern state ever did until way later. They gave black men the right to vote. If you want to know how the Ku Klux Klan started in Tennessee, it's like that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Within weeks, the Klan organically is crawling out of every corner of Middle Tennessee. And Nat Cheairs, although he was not in it, 5 of the original 6 members of the Ku Klux Klan were from his regiment.
Wow.
5 of the 6 were members of the 3rd Tennessee Infantry. And Nat Cheairs was the major of that regiment. He knew every one of them.
Wow.
And the Klan just exploded. That's how Forrest gets involved because they had an organization that was growing and they needed a figurehead. And so it's a violent white reaction against black men getting the right to vote. And it was a dual hatred. Guys like Forrest, I think Forrest was disgusted about the idea of black men voting, but God, he hated the governor, Brownlow. Oh, if Forrest could have ever gotten his hands around his neck, he would have just strangled him. And you know, we can look back on it, I guess, with some levity, but my God, it was just awful. I cover a lot of Freedmen's Bureau stuff in Volume 2. There was a Freedmen's Bureau school in Spring Hill, and the Klan targeted that school for almost 2 years, and they went after children, they went after parents. And so anybody who thinks that the Klan was anything other than domestic terrorists, they should read this book. It was awful.
Wow.
It was awful what they did to these people. And then there were people like Henry Eddy, who was a school teacher, and he stood up to the Klan. They would never actually target him, but they targeted black parents, they targeted black children. And it's a story about us.
Wow. Wow.
And that goes on, for years.
I'll ask you to, maybe this is a supposition, but do you think that if the white male population had been allowed to vote, that the reaction would have been as violent as it was?
No, I think that I'd long wondered, why did the Klan start here? Why not Mississippi? Why not South Carolina, where there was a much larger black population, where the friction always seemed to be a little sharper? Why Tennessee? Now I know.
Yeah.
Because the General Assembly that were run by radicals did something that the white population, whether you were a wealthy man like Nat Cheairs or the poorest white, you had everything taken away from you, and now all of a sudden you couldn't vote, but they could, they went insane.
Yeah.
And in 1870, when the Democrats got back in charge, they changed the state constitution. And they didn't take the vote away, but they instituted, guess what? A poll tax.
Okay. So,
And so by 1870, Tennessee's on its way. By 1873, the General Assembly had established separate white and black schools. And Nat Cheairs, I guess in summation, he never figured out how to farm well. I
mm,
don't think Nat Cheairs ever figured out how to effectively farm without slavery. I don't think he effectively ever figured out how to get anything done without that system. But his son did. His son, Will, occupies a good part of volume two. Will became a very successful farmer. He embraced the new labor situation, which meant paying people. And I think for him, it was just about making money. So whoever did the job, he paid him. And he did that for decades. He did that, in fact, until he sold the place in 1920.
wow. Wow. So he doesn't, so then what happens to the family if he's not passing that on to his next generation?
Well, he did. When his wife died, Nat couldn't have gotten out of RippaVilla any quicker. He
Okay.
literally sold it within a couple of months to his son, Will.
Okay.
And as I said earlier, then he's like a gypsy and he just sort of floats around. He didn't have any debt. He got $40,000 from his son, which is a good amount of money, and he just floated around.
Mm,
And he loved to fish in the Gulf. He spent a lot of time with one of his daughters who he bought land for in Texas. And he lived until 1914.
yeah.
He spent 20 plus years just sort of going wherever he wanted. And I've had people ask me why would he sell it? Why is he and his wife and their kids, they're all buried in Columbia. They're not buried at RippaVilla. I think the best answer I can come up with is by the time when in 1893 he was 75 years old. RippaVilla had been his world for 75 years. And I think he was just done.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think he said, you know what? I'm out of here.
Uh,
I'm going to go do what I want to do. And he did.
uh, well, is that any different than someone retiring and being a snowbird off to Florida? You know, it's sort of like
No,
new
he
new
is,
phase.
I'll say this. He is one of the few early 19th century people who lives that long, but he's one of the few who he strikes me as someone, although he never figured out how to farm again, well, he's a much more modern person.
Oh,
He
okay.
seems to be one of those, like if you see some 75-year-old who can't figure out how to run their iPhone, but then you see the one who does and is really good at it, that was Nat. He figured out all the new stuff.
Yeah.
And I think he kind of liked it. Um,
Mm,
I don't think he ever liked the change that he had to endure, but honestly, I don't know how many of those people ever could like that change. They just learned to live with it. And there is a lesson there. One thing I will say, and I've become fairly convinced of this, is many of our racial problems, especially when you get into Jim Crow, weren't because of people like Nat Cheairs. I think they kind of shook their head in disgust, but they moved on. Some of the most pernicious Jim Crow stuff were from people born in 1880 and 1890 and 1900.
mm,
It was the children and the grandchildren who seemed to have a real racial animus that exceeds the people that owned human beings, if that makes sense.
yeah. Yeah.
I think there was a familiarity with slave owners, and they were, when I looked at Spring Hill and Murray County in 1870 and 1875, there were a lot of black men who owned small tracts of land. They were farming. They did business together. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think they're hanging out or anything, but they're living together. It may not be harmonious, but they are living together. Those lines are obliterated by the 1890s and early 1900s. These harsh lines of segregation simply did not exist until after the Civil War.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what we live with as much as anything. And I go with the book all the way up to civil rights.
Mhm.
I mean, there's a civil rights connection to RippaVilla. One of the former McKissick slaves who lived at RippaVilla after the war, her great grandson was involved in an altercation in Colombia, which led to a series of racial fights over the course of several days. And one of the NAACP attorneys who showed up in Colombia in 1946 was Thurgood Marshall. So we're able to bridge that entire stretch of time. And so James Stevenson's great grandmother was born a slave and lived at RippaVilla. And he's connected to this incident that is really one of the early moments of the modern civil rights era.
You mentioned when General Motors finally comes in and they save RippaVilla. So in my head, I sort of feel like, is there some component of Faulknerian decline and decay, and RippaVilla and the family just sort of gets old and musty, and it requires, this economic revitalization for the town to fix it? Or yeah, how's the
No,
story end?
not really, because RippaVilla was owned after Will Cheairs sold it. It was only owned by a small handful of people. It was there was a 5 year stretch, and then there was like a 30-year stretch. Then there was a couple of short-term owners. But the last person who lived there, her name was Hesta Munns. She lived there from about 1961 to 1985. She died a few months before GM arrived. So the moral of the story is because it was always lived in, it was fairly well taken care of.
Okay.
But what GM did was they bought all the land on both sides of Columbia Pike, and they built the land on the west side, but they bought all the land on the east side so nobody could ever compete with them.
Yeah.
They just owned it all. Um, and they eventually made a. I don't think it could happen today. I don't think the litigious lawyers that exist today would allow this gentleman's agreement to unfold the way it did in the 80s. GM promised the people that owned RippaVilla at the end that if they sold it, they would restore it and keep it as a historic site. And they did it.
Wow.
And they ended up over the course of time donating not just 100 acres of prime real estate, but almost $1 million toward its restoration.
Wow.
And so that's a major corporate kind of private local endeavor that I don't know has ever happened anywhere in the country.
Wow.
I mean, GM isn't just anybody. I mean, this is a major corporation. And they saved an old historic home. They put HVAC in it. They donated 98 acres, which is what encompasses the site today. And so their legacy is an important part of the story too, because without them, who knows what would have happened.
Wow. Well, and I was a loyal Saturn owner for years, so now I feel like I've done my part to
Good,
support
good for you.
RippaVilla's. Yeah.
It was a great car, right? I mean, it was a really
Yeah.
great concept. It didn't get off the ground soon enough, and then, by the time it I think got some traction, just the whole world had changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the plant is still open today. General Motors still runs it.
Yeah.
And in fact, just to the south of where that first plant was built, there's a battery factory now, an electric battery factory.
Oh, I did not know that. Okay.
So GM is clearly, they see the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Electric cars, it may take 20 or 30 more years before the grid works, effectively, but they see the future.
Yeah. Right. Right. So if people want to get your book, which I encourage them to do, how can they do so?
Well, the easiest way is, I mean, if you're visiting, it's at all the sites we manage, obviously RippaVilla, but it's in Franklin too. Um, but online, just boft.org and go to our store. We've actually had some pre-sales, but just buy it and we'll ship it to you probably next day.
Fantastic. So, the Cheairs family, the Old Union, and then later on this summer, Volume 2, Rebirth of Freedom. So, congratulations. When you open those 96 boxes of books this afternoon, I hope your back holds out, and I hope you really have a great, exciting moment.
Well, it is going to be great. And then I've already got the next book, and the Joseph and I have we got to finish this George Wagner biography that
Okay.
we've been taunting people with for years. So I think we're going to try and knock that out later this year.
Yeah. Well, and let me put in a plug too for your Spring Hill book because I mean it's I mean just a fantastic book. Tell people real quickly about that if they for some reason have not fallen off the turnip truck and gotten that book, they really need to.
Well, that came out 20 years ago for Cause and for Country, a study of the affair at Spring Hill and the Battle of Franklin. The super long subtitle, right?
Yeah.
It's just the military campaign that Hood launched. I don't cover the Battle of Nashville. I've considered writing a separate book about that, but it's really the campaign through Franklin. And I believe and maintain to this day that that campaign is the termination of the war in the Western Theater. And of course, Grant and Sherman are they're the big guys out west. And what do? They have to go east to finish it off. So Sherman marches into the Carolinas, and Grant is he tracks down Lee at Appomattox. So the war in the West eventually folds right into the East. And I
Sure.
think that you have to come to Spring Hill and Franklin to see how it ended out here.
Uh, it is one of my favorite
It's the
battle
bookend.
studies.
It's the bookend to Appomattox. I
Yeah.
think it really is the bookend to Appomattox.
It's one of my favorite battle and campaign studies. I love it. So,
It's a great place. Well, I
yeah,
appreciate the time today.
yeah,
Thanks.
sure. Well, best of luck, Eric. Thanks for spending some time with us.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
So, I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.